it's a model that looks at the need from existing households, newly forming households, and what proportion of those can't meet their needs in the market without some form of financial support, and compares that to the supply from basically the turnover of existing affordable housing and what's in the development pipeline. Now, there's some detailed points which I'd like to go through, but I think the first thing to remember is that this model is really designed for looking at short-term time frame, and understanding was originally designed for looking at a short-term time frame, and for understanding whether there's a surplus or a deficit of affordable housing in the area. So the relevance, I think, when we're looking at and trying to compare it with household projections and overall housing need, is we're not quite comparing apples with apples. So we need to be quite careful about figures and treating figures in this respect. In terms of that issue, when we're looking, well, I think it's useful just to look at what types of households this includes. When we're looking at existing households, they're housed, they're in a home, and so then moving to another house will release up an existing quantity. So it doesn't necessarily result in an increase in the need for housing overall. It's about a side mix question, the mix of housing. The issue in terms of looking at questions and the relationship across to overall housing need is particularly about the things like concealed households, young households that can't afford. And we've set out within the local housing requirements study that specific issue. So if I could just refer you to paragraph, I think it's 416, within the assessment. So those households that are currently in need, 687 are currently housed, with 1,021 those that are homeless, no fixed abode, living with friends. Those are effectively those groups that might represent concealed households. Now, in comparing that across to demographic projections, what we can do is look at, well, how we adjusted, the way we've treated this in looking at overall housing need, is how we've adjusted the household projections and the household formation rates to effectively improve household formation rates and address existing levels of concealed households. We can quantify that through the demographic modelling. And if we look at the subnational population projections, so the base starting scenario, and we look at, for instance, a scenario with constant headship rates, and there was an improvement in headship rates in the core scenario mix, we can quantify that issue. And the difference between those two is 1,300 homes over the plan period. And so we're providing an additional, if the plan targets are met, is providing an additional 1,300 homes that support, or 1,300 homes that support addressing that issue around concealed households. Now that more than addresses the need for concealed households that are shown through the affordable housing analysis. So it has been specifically considered in the approach that we've taken and informed the conclusions that the study drawn.
So, this makes a point about whether or not we are meeting the need for affordable housing.
Yes, it's meeting the full need for market and affordable housing. It's set out in paragraph 57 in the end of the game. concealed households and household formation. And the conclusions drawn in the assessment meet that full need for market and affordable housing.
Mr. Baker, I'm going to just come back to you first of all, and I'm going to go to the screen. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think the focus on just concealed households is a little bit of a red herring, because the council, whilst this might reduce slightly over the plan period, the council will still be relying on the private rented sector to meet newly arising affordable needs. That's the simple conclusion that can be drawn from the 2014 report. Whilst there is an increase in the household formation rates for a certain age group to account for an increase in affordability and greater levels of unconcealing, if you like, of those particular section of the population, it doesn't address the fact that the council will continue to rely on the private rented sector to meet newly arising needs over the plan period, and that is simply in conflict with the national planning policy framework. And indeed, the OAN, which is supposed to be sort of policy free in that respect, takes account of that ongoing situation. And I completely agree that the private rented sector does currently meet a degree of affordable need, a newly arising affordable need. However, just because the situation is ongoing doesn't mean it's desirable or in line with national objectives. And I think if we just think about, it's very easy to talk about the private rented sector or the affordable sector and not understand the key difference. The key difference is with the private rented sector, the burden is essentially on housing benefits and on the state, whereas with newly provided affordable dwellings, that is subsidised by the landowner, by planning gain, and therefore reduces the overall burden on the state, the treasury, which is clearly in line with national objectives. So I think that's the critical point that I want to make, and it comes through both the evidence that Mr. Ireland has produced, but also in how the council has taken this OAN figure and taken it as read rather than taking it in light of the significant affordable needs in the county, and then assessed how it can better deliver new affordable houses, affordable in the definition of the NPPF, which will better meet the needs of those people who can't gain access to the market sector. And I'll be quiet before I'm drowned out by
did you have a similar point to make? Because yours completely separate.
It was a point of clarification on something Mr. Ireland said. You referred to the adjustment to the household formation rates, and you said that would result in an additional 1,300 homes. You've made several adjustments to household formation rates in the report. Which one is that actually referring to? Is that the full return to trend or partial return to trend?
In respect to the adjustments, it's looking at it in the aggregate and saying the conclusions that we've drawn based on apartment return to trend plus market signals adjustments to improve affordability, and comparing that to a situation with a more than constant hedging rates and the difference between the two to quantify the overall impact within the modelling of the adjustments made to household formation rates. If I could just touch on Mr. Baker's point.
Yes, I mean, yes. The focus on the concealed households and particular age group. and Mr Baker's point that what about everyone else, effectively, and will they have to rely on the private rented sector for accommodation? Will the figures that you produce be sufficient? It goes back to the original point about whether they will meet affordable housing.
We have worked over the last years quite hard with both the planning and the housing teams within the council to look at these issues. The council's housing team have a range of means of delivering affordable housing, and I think we shouldn't just restrict that to looking at Section 106 mechanism. There is the benefits that are elected by registered providers. The council has a number of regeneration schemes of its own to deliver affordable housing. In the last financial year, the council brought 171 existing homes back into use for affordable housing. And then we have policies regarding exception sites and exception site development as well. And that, I think, is one point here. If we look at the detail of the model, Mr Baker is right, there is the private rental sector plays some role in providing housing for people that need a degree of financial support. It does in this area as it does in every area of the country. The proposed housing provision in the plan would see that the role of the private rental sector reducing over time. So if you work through, as I have done, what the policies in the plan might mean, the expectation is that we see that role the private rental sector plays falling over time and more people housed directly in affordable housing using the NPP definition, effectively affordable housing in perpetuity. And that seems to me like a pretty positive framework for seeking to improve affordability in this area. I think the other factor that perhaps is worth touching on is that the affordability issue here is one of house prices, but it's also one of wages. And the council's economic strategy is quite squarely focused on seeking to improve and increase wage levels.
I switched it off. For some unknown reason, I think I switched it off.
And so part of the means of addressing the affordability issue are also about economic strategy. And the council's approach is very much focused on that. Mr Baker's own report touches mentions quite clearly the relationship between wages and affordability in Herefordshire.
I just wanted to again come back on a couple of points. I mean, Mr Ireland began to wheel off a number of avenues for where affordable housing will be generated outside Section 106 agreements and through the typical means. And I just wanted to ask specifically, where is that within the council's evidence base, and where is it specifically referenced and assessed how much affordable housing, not necessarily a windfall, but how much affordable housing will be delivered through other avenues and how that will be discounted against overall needs?
Yes.
That would seem a specific point. I know Mr Ireland sort of casually referenced a few specifics, but one would hope it would be within the sustainability appraisal, which is the key sort of measure of how effective policies will be. A second point is about, I agree it is positive that the reliance on the private rental sector will be reduced slightly. However, it's clear that objective assessments of need should not assume that the private rented sector will play a role. That is a policy decision specifically that's the conclusion that was arrived at by the Eastleigh planning inspector, who specifically said that it's not the role of the objective assessment unit to take into account the private rented sector and how that will function and meet affordable needs. Rather, it's the role of the objective assessment unit to consider how full needs for affordable will be met, or rather what the full affordable needs will be and how those needs reconcile with full market housing needs. And I think that it goes back to the tension that I raised earlier with regards to the evidence for this. That it seems that Mr. Ireland's report and through his sort of taking on of this discussion from the council, it seemed that less of a policy decision and more like some partiality within that piece of evidence with regards to the policy exercise, and I find that concerning. Thank you.
Mr. Wharton, did you want to make a point?
It's just a small point, following on from the point that Ms. Green raised about the implications of uplift, and putting aside the issue about household formation rates, it comes across from table 20, I just want to clarify now, table 20 of the J3, that suggests the actual market uplift to
Mr. Wharton, sorry, page?
Page 54, table 20. The implications of the mechanism that's been put forward in light of what we just heard about the level of affordable housing needs, the implication it appears only to be an uplift of 36 dwellings per annum. And that doesn't seem like a significant adjustment to take into account a market uplift, given the affordability issues we've just heard about. But also, Mark, if you turn to page 78 of the same document and figure, A1.17, it actually shows the proportion of population that the market signal is applied to. And that is that if it's applied to the ages between 25 and 34, my calculations are in the second column, which says the population in 2031 is actually only 9% of the population in 2031. In terms of population growth, it's only affecting 2.3% of the population growth. Now, I acknowledge that some of that population already exists, but my point is, Mark, I don't think the mechanism is effective and sound to suggest that only 36 dwellings is a reasonable market uplift to take into account affordability, particularly looking at the population profile on table 8.1.17. And that's aside from the points that we're talking about the potential changes to the household formation rates. I just suggest, Mark, that the mechanism at the present point in time is not effective.
So, if we pick up Mr. Baker's first point about the evidence for the other mechanisms for delivery and how you assess that and where that comes in your calculations. And the second point, which is often tricky, is about the policy, where the policies fit in. So you have the objectively assessed needs, and then you look at those without the policy, and then you look at them with the policy to come to your eventual figure. But so if we can take the first point about where that's addressed in your evidence.
The simple answer regarding where the council sets out the various mechanisms it uses to deliver affordable housing is in its housing strategy. That's the case for this council, as with most others around the country.
In terms of numbers, though, have you investigated numbers that might produce and how that might feed into meeting the need?
We've worked in detail with the housing policy team in producing the evidence base that sits underneath that strategy, which is aligned to the work undertaken here.
Would I be able to see that in terms of numbers?
In terms of numbers that the council do set out, and it's set out on the council's website, a target for the expectations about affordable housing delivery year by year, a year
And by as a means by which they'll...
And the means are set out in the housing strategy that sits behind that. That's all on the council's website. Just, I think, a point of clarity. In deriving the conclusions on objectively assessed need, we're not reliant at all on the private rented sector. We have looked at issues relating to households, to household formation, to addressing concealed households and so forth. There is no reliance here on that.
And that goes back to the earlier point about the fact that it concentrated on concealed households, and I asked you about that. So your view, the objectively assessed needs, they have been, their policy of, I hate this term, but they are effectively, in the view, policy of.
It is a policy of assessment. The policy on assessment, in this case, is the target within the plan. So we have a policy off range, as it were, from 15,400 to 16,200, and a policy on in the plan for 16,500. Those are the relevant figures, I think, in that respect.
Then some points were picked up about the mechanism that we've used with the uplift. Are you able to answer those points for me, Mr. Watton?
Yes, certainly. I think perhaps one of the easiest ways to do this is to refer to some of the graphs that are set out in the appendix, one of the appendices that will find the appropriate page reference.
If you can just make sure that I'm on the right page before you start. Just a minute.
It's, on my version, it's page 76. That's this 1A, just on the flip back page. It's a series of graphs on the left-hand page there.
Okay, so we're on that page. Yes.
Figure A1.13.
Figure A1.
And what this shows is the household formation rates for various age groups in terms of what's projected